Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture on the epistemic good and the good life, or how truth and knowledge relate to the good life. So, before we jump into this topic, I want to briefly recap where we're at in terms of our theory of knowledge. So, remember that knowledge, so far we have this idea of knowledge, right? What is knowledge? Knowledge is justified, true belief, right? For you to know something, you need to believe it. There's no such thing as saying that Sally knows X if Sally doesn't believe it. That doesn't make any sense, right? Also, knowledge requires true belief, right? There's no such thing as knowing falsehoods. Remember the example that I used about the person who learns that Obama is the current president of the United States. That doesn't make any sense for us to say that that person knows that Obama is the current president of the United States. You cannot know falsehood. And lastly, the next part is the justification, right? Justify true belief. And so for you to have knowledge, not only do you have to believe, and your belief has to be true, but it has to be justified. Think again about the jurors example from Plato, where even if you convince a group of jurors that this person is a criminal, and they are the criminal, but you convince them on the basis of bad reasons like emotional appeal or anecdote, even if the jurors believe correctly because the person is a criminal, they still do not know that the person is the criminal, right? You need justification over and above true belief, right? And then, as we came to learn this week with the Gideon cases, they provide an extra condition on justification, right? So we can still think about knowledge being justified through belief, but we need to think about a little bit closer about what justification and the idea of having defeaters. In particular, we have this idea that your knowledge cannot rest on false assumptions, right? Because that would be a defeater for your justification. So that's where we are today. And now we're going to talk about, well, what elements of knowledge are actually valuable for the good life? And the surprising part, or one of the surprising parts, I think, is that the justification part of knowledge has very little bearing on the good life. It's actually the truth that has most of the value in a good life. Surprisingly enough, maybe. And in fact, what actually seems to be more, or what seems to have more value for a good life is not so much knowledge, but understanding. So that is the main takeaway from this lecture. All right, so let's begin. So here are the central questions which Zagzebski evaluates. How does truth have value contingent or depending upon other things we value? Is truth valuable for its own sake? And I want you to pause here for a second, because it seems like it would seem like a compelling thing to say that surely truth is valuable for its own sake, that it's intrinsically valuable, right? Most of us kind of seem to believe that, right? And yet, as we will see, that may not be the case. 3, is every true belief valuable, all things considered? Again, this is a sentiment that I think most people would express, but as we'll see shortly, there are really good reasons to doubt that this is the case. 4, and what do these questions about truth reveal about the value of knowledge? Okay, and again, what's going to be very interesting about this question is that knowledge itself, especially what makes that element that distinguishes knowledge from mere true belief, that justification part, does not actually seem that valuable for life, which is really interesting. So let's try to work it together. All right, so first, Zagzebski distinguishes between desirable and admirable goods. And a desirable good, we kind of come across this distinction under a different name before, right? These are just things that are good for our well-being, right? We tend to desire things that are good for our well-being, so things that are good for us, right? Health, and we're talking about instrumentally good or intrinsically good, but health, right? Friendship, satisfying work, comfort, right? We've talked about lots of these things when we did our session on well-being. And then there are admirable goods, and these are fitting objects of admiration, moral and intellectual virtues, artistic excellence, and achievements, right? Now, this is again a little bit tricky, but and I'm saying it's a little bit tricky because it seems like achievements could be good for us, or certainly people have argued for it. But I think the distinction is good. So let's just focus on the distinction and not so much on the things which Zagzebski categorizes as being part of this distinction, right? So there are desirable goods, things are good for us, and then there are things which we admire, right? And this is the distinction surely makes sense, especially when we're talking about another person, right? So I can admire somebody else's achievement, and that achievement doesn't improve my well-being, right? So in that sense, that makes sense. Now, the more interesting question maybe is whether my own achievements are both admirable and arguably also good for me. Again, depends on your theory of well-being. But again, just for the sake of argument, let's just keep this distinction in mind, because I think this distinction does work for what Zagzebski uses it for, if that makes sense. Or we'll see in a second. All right, so true belief, according to Zagzebski, is desirable for us, or it could be, or that's really what is at stake, right? So here's an example of when a true belief is good for someone. So a patient guesses that their headache is due to dehydration, drinks water, and the headache goes away. The true belief benefits them because it leads to health. Okay? So this patient guesses, right, that their headache is due to dehydration. They do have dehydration. So they have a true belief. But much like the examples we discussed earlier this week, they do not know that they have a true belief, right? Because they just guessed. They got lucky, right? Yet, this true belief brings genuine benefits to their lives because they're able to drink water and relieve their symptoms, okay? Now compare this with a case of knowledge. A doctor, so instead of you guessing, suppose that this is you, instead of you guessing that you're dehydrated, instead suppose you go to the doctor who has training, tests, and has gone through medical school and uses careful reasoning and expertise to diagnose the same problem. That is, they diagnose that you are dehydrated. And according to Zagzebski, the doctor earns credit for arriving at the truth through skills, right, and their intellectual virtues, right? And so you should admire their knowledge. Excuse me. But notice that this knowledge does not benefit you over and above the true belief. Another way of putting it this way is that you are not better off in either of these cases, right? Like, or you're not better off in the case in which you go to your doctor versus whether you just get lucky and diagnose your own dehydration. Because in both cases, you address the problem, right? You drink water and your headaches are relieved. So you're not better off just because your diagnosis came from knowledge as opposed to mere luck, right? And so that's the interesting part that Zagzebski wants to first suggest, is that true belief is what's actually good for you, not knowledge. But then, of course, there's this intuition that Zagzebski needs to account for, but it seems like we admire or there's something good associated with knowledge. And she says, yes, there is. And there's this idea of credit. Knowledge has to do with us crediting people for having this justification. You do get credit. It's just that credit has nothing to do with well-being, interestingly enough, or with goodness for us, right? All right. So let's talk now. So now we've established that some truths are good for us and not necessarily knowledge, right? But not all truths are good for us, right? Because some cause suffering. So we're going to go through an argument and several instances of how truth may fail to be good for us, and then we'll see what this leads to. So the first premise we can say is that not all truths are desirable. Some cause suffering or are trivial. Some false beliefs may occasionally be better than true ones. That's the second premise. Okay, so these are two different ones, right? Number one says not all truths are desirable because they can cause suffering. This is a comparative case, and actually, not only not having some truths are desirable, but actually having false beliefs is maybe better than true ones. So these are two different types of cases, even though they sound similar. And then there's three trivial truths, like number of grains of sand, like believing, like, or knowing, or having the truth about the number of grains of sand usually lack value unless connected to important ends. Okay? Therefore, truth is only prima facie, or at face value, that's what prima facie means, at face value desirable. Not always desirable, all things considered. So remember from the previous slide, if truth beliefs can be desirable, like the example we just said, and good for us, but it's only at face value because these instances show that often they're not good for us. So let's go through each of these examples. So let's start with number one. Actually, let's start with number two. Some false beliefs may occasionally be better than true ones. So here are the examples. Placebo effect in medicine. A patient falsely believes a sugar pill is a powerful painkiller. The belief reduces their pain and improves quality of life. So again, in this case, suppose that you are in pain, or even perhaps more realistic, suppose that somebody's feeling depressed, right? And they receive a placebo, like a sugar pill. And as it often is the case, when you look at the studies for antidepressants, there is this very strong placebo effect, right? And this person or you, or let's suppose this is your friend, feels like their depression is gone, and they go, oh wow, that medicine really worked, and I feel so much better and clear-headed. And so, but suppose that you know that they just took a sugar pill. And so here's the question: is that false belief better than if they were true? And one way of diagnosing this is, would you tell your friend the truth in that case? Right? Would you tell them, actually, you took a sugar pill? Or would you just allow them to have the false belief so that they can feel better? And I think for a lot of people, including Zagzebski, they might be like, yeah, you probably don't need to, you can allow them to have the false. Now, of course, it becomes a little bit tricky if they ask you, like, hey, do you know whether this is true or not, right? And then, because then that involves you lying, per se, right? Or at least, arguably, it changes the equation a little bit, as opposed to them just allowing them to continue in their false beliefs, right? Here's another example. Optimistic self-deception. So an athlete falsely believes they have a good chance of winning against overwhelming odds. The false belief motivates them to train harder and achieve more than if they had faced the discouraging truths. So a lot of times, optimistic self-deception, and this can happen to all of us, we can be so optimistically self-deceived about our ability to achieve something that we work so hard and we improve and perform so much better that we end up it ends up being good for us, right? Even though it's a false belief, better than if we accurately understood the state of affairs, right? So suppose that somebody wants to be an astronaut, and the odds of you becoming an astronaut are so slim because it's just such a, for one, there aren't that many jobs available, right? But somebody's just convinced that they want to be an astronaut, and they work so hard in school, right? Even though that's almost an irrational belief to have, right? But because they work so hard in school, they get good grades, and they end up, maybe going to medical school instead, which again is amazing, an amazing accomplishment. Medical schools are so incredibly competitive. But had they not believed that they could be an astronaut, even though that was a foolish belief to a certain extent, they would not have accomplished what they have. Again, in that case, it seems like them having these false beliefs about expectations was good for them rather than the truth, right? Instead of having somebody sit down and tell them, no, you cannot. The odds that you're an astronaut are slim to none. Like it's almost impossible, right? Or you can imagine cases where this is the case, right? Maybe somebody who's 5'5" wants to be a basketball player, right? That's almost impossible, right? And they work hard, and because they work hard, they develop all of this value in respect to being healthy, and maybe they watch their diet and become very disciplined, and so they acquire all these goods in their life based on a false belief, right? All right, so that's why truth in these cases may not be good for someone. Okay, now let's go back. Oh, okay. This is an illusion of permanence in relationships. So somebody can falsely believe again that one's loved one will always be there, and that can foster a sense of security and allow deeper attachment, even if mortality makes this untrue, right? Um, and you can imagine cases where this becomes more the illusion becomes more overt. Like suppose that somebody gets married with somebody who's a lot older, like let's say a 30-year-old gets married with a 50-year-old, and the 30-year-old may engage in a self-delusion because they think, oh, we have all of this life ahead of us where we can have kids and we'll always be together. But given the age difference, 20 years is a long time. And she may even think, oh, I'm never going to be alone. But the odds are that most likely the 20-year-old partner most likely will die first, right? But all of that self-delusion can be enhanced and good for this person instead of them believing the actual truth, which is that more than likely you're going to live probably close to 20 years by yourself towards the end of your life, right? So anyways, that's another example. Okay, so here's a different kind of example. These are not all truths are desirable because some can cause suffering or triviality. So the example we just saw was that they are false beliefs that lead to good outcomes. Now we're looking at the other side, which is actually some truths themselves can cause suffering. Okay? For example, medical prognosis. A patient may learn with certainty that they have a terminal illness and only 6 months to live. This truth may cause immense distress, robbing them of peace or hope. So, in this case, the truth for this person may not be good for them because suppose that it makes them live their life in a depressed state. The last 6 months of their life, now they're depressed, right? Because they're gonna die. That's not unreasonable, right? And it would have been better, perhaps, for this patient to not know this, or to not know this truth, or believe this truth, and live their life, the rest of their life, more happily, right? And this is actually an expectation or a norm, rather, in certain communities, right? In Asia and even certain Hispanic communities, where especially if it's an elderly patient, the doctors or the medical professionals will not tell the patient that they have a terminal illness, but they'll tell the family, and the family is aware, makes the arrangements, but they don't tell the family member, right? So you can kind of see that this has some plausibility within certain cultures. Now, for us in the West, this is more difficult, right? Because that almost seems like could be seen as a violation of autonomy, right? Like if I'm the patient, I need you to treat me like an autonomous being and tell me the truth. Maybe in this case, right? And so this is, I think, a little bit of a more tricky example, and maybe your intuitions will go one way or the other. All right, here's another example. So, and this is probably one that we're more familiar with, which is harsh personal truths. Like someone may be told honestly that their partner no longer loves them, even though the relationship was otherwise happy. The truth in this case may harm their well-being, right? Maybe somebody is in a marriage and maybe the husband, let's just hypothetically say, doesn't really love their spouse anymore, but maybe they enjoy them as a friend, but not as a romantic partner, and they have kids, so he doesn't want to break up the family, right? And so he just stays in the marriage, as probably some people do, even though they don't actually romantically love their spouse anymore. And suppose they tell a friend, suppose they tell you. And so what do you do in that case, right? Do you tell the spouse, the wife, hey, your husband actually doesn't romantically love you anymore, he just kind of sees you as a friend, um and he's kind of just staying for the sake of the kids? And if you do that, then you would perhaps cause a great deal of unhappiness in that marriage. Maybe even they might even get divorced, right? Who knows, right? But the point is that in that case, it may seem that that truth may not actually be beneficial for this person. It gets tricky, right? I think that this is trickier than the other example that we were discussing about false beliefs. Like I can imagine people on both sides of this having legitimate points. All right. So let's take stock. So we've talked about not all truths are desirable because they may cause suffering. Some beliefs may occasionally be better than true ones. So we talked about that. And now we talk to this idea about trivial truths. So if somebody says all truth is valuable, and you can imagine somebody saying that, this seems like a very good refutation of that, because surely knowing the value, knowing the number of, for example, of blades of grass outside my the patch of grass in the front of my house seems like a trivial truth that will not make anyone better off, right? Like just knowing how many grains of sand there are in a bucket, let's say, seems like a trivial truth that will not benefit anyone's life, or that is not good. It's just not important, right? And so trivial truths are not good at all. They're not bad. They're just neutral, right? Therefore, truth, like the concept of truth, is only prima facie, or at face value, desirable / good, but not always desirable, all things considered. And these are some examples. All right, what does that mean for the value of knowledge, right? Well, if what is good about knowledge is only, remember, knowledge is justified true belief. Justified true belief. If what is valuable about knowledge is only the true belief part and not the justification, right? Remember the example of dehydration? Then it follows, and what makes the truth of belief good for us is that it's desirable, something that we care about, right? Then it follows that the value of knowledge is determined by what we care about. It's ultimately very subjectivist. So if true belief is not always desirable, then knowledge of such truth is not valuable either, right? That's the first point I made. And knowledge only has value where the truth it secures is valuable, right? And this challenges the assumption in philosophy that all knowledge is a great good, right? Which is, again, it's a surprising conclusion, but a very plausible conclusion, right? As we have seen. And again, this is just an interesting question, or it's not a paradox, but it is interesting, right? Because remember, earlier this week, my apologies, we had been talking about like what is this and this thing about knowledge that makes it special, as different from mere true belief, right? And it turns out that whatever that is, the justification part slash not having a defeater, like all of the Gettier stuff, it turns out that is what makes knowledge, but it has no bearing, it has no value. Interestingly enough, I think that is one of the more surprising and interesting conclusions that we can reach. All right, and this is So what is desirable knowledge? So knowledge can be good, right? So it's not. So we're not saying that knowledge has no value. It's just that knowledge, good knowledge or valuable knowledge, is desirable knowledge, but ultimately it depends on the kind of truth in question. So it has to do more with the kind of facts that we know, rather than the fact that we know them, right? So they have to be truths that are connected with what we legitimately care about, right? Like art, science, religion, morality. Trivial truths, they don't count. And again, even cases in which the false beliefs are more valuable, in those cases, that wouldn't be desirable knowledge, right? Desirable knowledge is not, for example, the fact that you are taking a placebo and it's gonna remove all the benefits for you believing that the medication was working for you. Or, for example, another example is that if you're really positive about your prognosis, like for example with cancer, that can help you actually increase your chances against the cancer, right? Reduce the tumor size, right? That's a very important aspect. But if somebody tells you, per se, that actually your odds of survival are like 1%, and so you become very pessimistic, then that makes it even less likely that you survive, right? So that's where that knowledge might not be desirable, right? Because it's not good for us. All right. And undesirable knowledge, so this is, I guess I just gave you an example of undesirable knowledge, are truths that distract from meaningful pursuits or cause harm. All right, so that's, and of course, from this it follows that epistemology should focus on explaining desirable knowledge and not just truth in general. Now, let us recall this idea that even though knowledge is not valuable, we think it's special, not because it's valuable, but because people should still get credit for knowledge. Knowledge is like an achievement, right? And here's an example, right? Columbus. So Columbus discovered America, right? Now, either he discovered it accidentally, right? We don't really know. Some people say that he discovered America just by sheer luck. Maybe that's true. But it's possible that he could have discovered it because he knew where to go and look for a new continent, right? So in that case, what we want to say is that if Columbus had like reasoned using a map and like actually had discovered a new continent, then Columbus gets credit for that, even though the value itself wouldn't change, right? Like whether he got there accidentally or not doesn't really change the value, because everything that came from Columbus finding the Americas still came about whether he found it accidentally or by knowledge. So that is the example. You get credit for knowledge, but even if knowledge itself or the part that makes knowledge different from true belief is not actually valuable. Okay, now here's the interesting part, because there's something in the vicinity that we may call understanding, and it's different from knowledge. And Zagzebski argues that understanding actually is good for us. So how does understanding differ from knowledge? Well, knowledge, first, notice that knowledge is propositional. Well, what does that mean? It means that we always know propositions. So, for example, you know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's a proposition. You know that there's a piano behind me. So all the things that we know are always like propositional. You know that I am 34 years old because I told you, right? So that is knowledge, right? And it's propositional. Understanding is not propositional. Understanding involves a certain abilities to put things together or to represent information in a certain way, right? So when I say that I'm 34 years old, which is true, that sentence in English that you now know, which is Daniel is 34 years old, represents the world in a certain way. Namely, it represents a human being whose name is Daniel, whose age is 34. So propositions represent the world, and you know these propositions. But there are other ways to represent the world, and that is using maps or diagrams, right? Or even music, maybe if you're talking about music knowledge, right? And so this is where understanding comes in. So if I tell you, for example, that there is this city called Pearland that is 20 miles south of Houston. Okay? You understand that propositionally, right? Or somebody, if you understand what the concept of north means and 20 miles, then you understand in a way, you know that Pearland is 20 miles south of Houston. Like, you know that. That is very different from you learning the map of the region of Houston, right? And the greater area of Houston and where exactly Pearland is with respect to Houston, right? Now you have understanding of the geography around Houston, and so somebody and so when you say somebody who has that understanding, when they say, oh, I know that Pearland is north of Houston 20 miles, there's a difference, right, in understanding that versus merely knowing it. And that understanding is what Zagzebski thinks is actually valuable for us to have, to actually understand music, right? For example, or arts. It's a skill, right? Maybe many of you are taking certain science courses, and so you're understanding the way that the atom works. Actually, the example of atom is a great example, because even in that case, you might be gaining understanding without getting knowledge. And here's what I mean by that. So many of us may learn the model of the atom as the nucleus and the electrons going around in circles, kind of like a little planet, right? That is useful for us to understand what the atom is insofar as how it relates with the nucleus and the electrons and the proteins, right? Protons, right? But as a matter of fact, the atom does not look like that, right? And many of you guys know this. Electrons are not going around the nucleus. In fact, electrons don't even have discrete locations, like in particular in space. Electrons are better understood as occupying space in probability. This is what makes chemistry and quantum mechanics so a little bit difficult to understand. There's a 30% chance that the electron is here. Like, there's probability distribution about the electricity, right? They don't have discrete locations. But for us to better acquire understanding, and in fact how historically we acquired understanding about the atom, we had this model that resembled a planetary system, the electron going around the nucleus, even though it's false, but it enhanced our understanding. And you acquiring that understanding of the atoms, or the basic blocks of reality, is good for you, even if in that case technically it was false. And you'll see this in science all the time, right? Like, when you are doing lots of experiments, you just make assumptions which are clearly false, right? Why? Because it gives you understanding, right? All right. So understanding, it's what's important. Now, how do we? So understanding involves grasping relations, right? Like part to whole, cause and effect. Again, I just gave you multiple examples of these. Here's an interesting feature about understanding, and that's that it cannot be transmitted by testimony. It must be acquired by the learner. So what does Zagzebski mean by this? What does testimony mean? It just means somebody tells you something. Knowledge can be transferred by somebody telling you, by testimony, provided that they're a reliable source for the kind of knowledge, right? So for example, I just told you that I am 34 years old. Now you have acquired knowledge. I've given you knowledge, right? Because now you know that I'm 34 years old. It's not the most useful knowledge, but it's knowledge nonetheless. And it's knowledge because I am a reliable source for my own age, right? Now, if I was telling you the age of somebody else, of your cousin, that would seem suspect, right? Because I'm not a reliable testimony for your cousin's age, right? I have never met them. But I'm a reliable source for my own age, right? And you also know there are other rational factors. I have no reason to lie to you, right? You can also draw on the fact that I kind of look like I'm 34, right? I've lost most of my hair, so like you kind of make inferences. Yeah, that makes sense. And so you've acquired knowledge that I am 34. All right. So then, but here's the thing. You cannot acquire understanding but just mere testimony, right? Like for you to understand something, you need to like be able to grasp. And I mean, again, the example of the map works really well. I can tell you, and now you know that Pearland is 20 miles south of Houston, but you don't understand that, right? In a robust sense of the geography of Houston and how it relates to Pearland, right? That would require a skill that you would have to develop. Likewise with chemistry, again, or whatever science you're taking. Somebody can just tell you what calculus is, but you don't understand calculus if you don't acquire that understanding, which comes with practice and skills, right? Same with music. Somebody in you guys who are musicians probably will understand this example really well. Somebody can just tell you what a note is or how it relates, just and you can know music theory, but if you don't play music and you don't understand, then yeah, you just don't understand. And that understanding comes with practice, with skills, not with somebody just telling you what the answer is, right? The propositional knowledge, right? So knowledge can be transferred um, through testimony. And this is where the idea also of experts comes in, right? Should you believe experts on certain issues, right? And the answer is, yeah, you probably should believe, and because you can acquire knowledge from experts, right? If a group of scientists that have been studying chemistry tell you that you should probably believe this, right? Then you should probably believe that because they're experts, right? But here's where it becomes tricky. Or let me suggest two. How do I put this? Actually, let me back up. Here's where I think Zabzewski might not appreciate the full extent of testimony and knowledge in particular. And in particular, Zabzewski thinks that knowledge can be transferred by testimony. I don't think that seems right, especially when it comes to, and other philosophers, not just me, when it comes to moral knowledge, right? So sorry. So this is just an example of just knowledge can be transferred by testimony. Like an expert tells you the water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 Celsius, you should believe them, the scientists, right? And you acquire knowledge, right? But the question is, can moral knowledge be transferred by testimony? And my suggestion to you is that it can't. Let me give you an example. Suppose, let's talk about what is moral knowledge? Well, it's knowledge about what is right or wrong, right? And I'll give you an example. Like, I mean, either veganism is true or is not, right? And veganism is moral knowledge, right? Veganism says eating meat is morally right? Or morally wrong, sorry. It says eating meat is morally wrong. Now, suppose that you have a bunch of moral philosophers that tell you to be a vegan, okay? Or maybe to not be a vegan. Like, that's the point, actually. The point is that there's something very fishy, to put it mildly, about you based on what the experts say for you to believe a moral proposition. Like you should not believe that vegan is true or vegan is false. Like, you should not believe that eating meat is morally right or morally wrong because an expert told you. There's something inherently fishy about that, about moral knowledge. For you to acquire moral knowledge, it seems like you must have understanding. That's the difference between, I think, not regular knowledge about the world and moral knowledge. For moral knowledge, for you to accurately be able to judge that either eating meat is morally right or morally wrong, you need to acquire understanding about morality for you to actually know that. And this conflation, I think, has practical implications. And I think we've seen these in many cases. So, for example, during the pandemic, maybe you guys remember the pandemic, there was this issue about, and we all remember listening to the experts, right? And that's true. You should be listening to the experts about the various facts about how viruses behave and how vaccines behave, right? Because those are facts. But ultimately, whether you should take the vaccine, to be honest, or whether you should go outside or wear a mask, that was a moral decision. And that is a decision that you needed to take by understanding the morality behind your action, and not because an expert told you, because that's not the kind of thing that an expert can say, right? Because again, it requires understanding. You should not say the morally right thing to do is to do X or Y because because the expert said so, right? Um, or likewise, this actually is something that's happening right now, like in the Middle East. However you feel about the war in Gaza, whether you think it's genocide or not, there is a conflation that often happens because on one side there's one side that always says, actually it could be either side that can say this, oh, you cannot make a judgment about what's happening in Gaza because you're not an expert, right? You don't know the history of the place, the history of the relations between the Gazian people and the Israelite people, and so you cannot make a judgment about this. But again, if you what you're trying to make is a moral judgment, then you can make a more, if you have the understanding of morality, right? Like you don't need, another way of putting this whole point is that there's no such thing as acquiring moral beliefs based on moral experts. There's no moral experts in that sense. There are experts about the history of Israel. There are experts about how viruses behave and so on and so forth, and about pandemics. But there are no such thing as moral experts that can, from which you can simply adopt moral beliefs. That's just not a thing. And so again, when it comes to the Middle East, for example, and they say you're not allowed to have a moral opinion on this because you're not an expert, that's a fallacy, right? Because there's no such thing as moral experts in that sense. And in fact, you should form your own moral beliefs about that based on your own understanding, because that's the only way that you can have moral knowledge, is by having understanding of the morality behind the issues in question. All right, so that concludes this lecture, and next week we'll continue talking about knowledge, and we're going to talk about, on Tuesday, misinformation and fake news, and then on Thursday we'll talk about epistemic bubbles. I will see you then.